A teaching video from Kendrick. Yes, it has been a while. It has been quite some time, but I feel like this lesson here is very much needed in the poetry community, okay? The number one bad habit that's holding your poetry back is you are prioritizing the addition of mechanisms over the removal of negatives, okay? Now, these might seem like really fancy, weird terms you've never heard of. I didn't come up with them myself. I first heard about it in the self-development sphere of YouTube, specifically from a YouTuber named Casey Xander. However, I've also noticed that these methods apply to how poets try to improve their poetry. Now, let me explain what each method is so you can see how poets prioritize the addition of mechanisms and set aside the removal of negatives when they really should be prioritizing that. When it comes to improving one's poetry, people often try to look for the flashy new poetic device, literary technique to add to their poems, okay? Maybe it's something fancy that is trendy in the poetry community, maybe a sort of cadence in speech, maybe a certain poetry form, whatever the case may be. And they want to add new things to their arsenal, but they don't consider what bad habits remain within the foundation of their work, okay? In other words, you as a poet tend to be more focused on the addition of mechanisms, so the addition of new things to improve your poetry, as opposed to the removal of negatives, the negative things that are holding your poetry back. We're prioritizing as poets new techniques to add to our arsenal, which is good, there's nothing wrong with that, thinking that it's going to fix the underlying issues within our poem. That's the issue there. So we're prioritizing the addition of mechanisms over the removal of negatives. That is the number one bad habit I see poets make on a daily basis. And I'm no different. I used to make that mistake a lot. Now, the reason for this is quite simple. Sacrifice is hard. It is much easier to add a shiny new toy to your collection than to remove a negative, I don't want to call it a cancer, that might be a bit too strong, but a negative aspect of your poetry that you've come to identify with because you've used it over a prolonged period of time, okay? It is much easier to add something shiny and new to your collection than to let go of something you've come to identify with. And don't get me wrong, that sacrifice is a risk, right? The risk of letting go of something that you've resonated with for a while. Maybe you're not 100% certain that it is a bad habit in the first place, okay? That sacrifice, as risky as it is, risk is necessary for growth, all right? One of my favorite motivational speakers by the name of Les Brown, he's quoted as saying this. I don't know if this quote comes from him originally, but he says this: if you cannot take risks, you cannot grow. If you cannot grow, you cannot become your best. If you can't become your best, you can't be happy. And if you can't be happy, then what else is there? I cannot tell you how many times I see poets who are very dissatisfied with their work, no matter what new tricks or tactics they add to their content, okay? And this is spoken word poets, this is rappers, this is page poets, you name it. The point still stands. So many poets are dissatisfied with their work, thinking it's because of a lack of self-love. Sometimes, maybe, sure, it could be. But I'm telling you right now, more often than not, in my personal opinion, it is because they know that they aren't doing everything necessary to improve their poetry, which will include removing the negative aspects of your poems as opposed to always trying to add new shiny things, okay? Because they're not willing to take that risk, they're not able to grow. And because they're not able to grow, they're not able to become their best. And since they're not becoming their best, they're not becoming happy. Do you see what I'm trying to say? The number one bad habit that is holding your poetry back is you are prioritizing the addition of mechanisms over the removal of negatives. I'm gonna give you 5 examples of each of them to show you exactly what I mean, okay? So let's start off with the 5 examples of the addition of mechanisms in poetry. The addition of innovative poetry forms, all right? I see people doing this a lot. They think they're not getting published because they're not using the right poetry form, and sure, that might be contributing to it some, maybe, all right? Back in the late 2000s, early 2010s, a really new avant-garde kind of poetry form I noticed was the crown sonnet, okay? So a lot of people, maybe they were using the Petrarchan sonnet as their poetry form. This is for page poets, obviously. If not the Petrarchan sonnet, the Shakespearean sonnet, or the Italian sonnet, whatever. When crown sonnets were introduced, it was like, oh, that's a crazy new form. It's so cyclical in nature. I remember people going crazy over that, thinking that was what was going to take their poetry to the next level. And I mean, for some people, it surely might have. Sure, fine. But it's not going to be the difference maker most of the time between you getting published and you getting, like, not getting published. You see what I'm saying? Okay, here's some other examples. Number 2, adding shiny new rhyme schemes, okay? So this will even apply to you rappers. I remember when trap became a really big thing in the rap industry, everybody was going crazy over the triplet flow, right? You see people like Cardi B, Migos using the triplet flow, and a lot of these up and coming rappers were like, oh, that's it. If I start using that, I'll blow up. And a lot of them, they didn't really go anywhere, okay? Sure, it's a nice rhyme scheme. It's real catchy, sounds really good. Ain't nothing wrong with adding that to your arsenal, but that's not going to make up for the deficiencies that lie within the foundation of your poetry. All right, here's a third example of the addition of mechanisms I see a lot. And this is for you spoken word poets specifically. Well, not specifically, but oftentimes. The addition of new cadences, right? Changing your tonality or speech rhythm, like the flow and the tempo as you're going through your lines and stuff like that. Sure, you know, adding new cadences and things of that nature can definitely help. For sure, it can. But I'm telling you, if the lyrical content ain't where it needs to be, if you're having bad habits, and I'll get into some of those like bad habits that need to be removed, right? The removal of negatives in a second. But yeah, with those bad habits there, I don't care what kind of cadence you utilize. If the content's weak, the content's weak, okay? Number 4, the addition of flashy choreography. I see poets do this all the time, especially in slams. A lot of slam poets will think that if they have the flashiest choreography, maybe they're just like doing crazy stuff, practically dancing on the stage in front of the mic, you know what I mean? That will be the difference maker in taking their poem from like an 8 to a 10. And it's not the case. Okay, it's not the case. I'm sure you'll be able to mask some of the, I don't want to call it flaws, but deficiencies, I suppose, within your poem because of the choreography. You might be able to mask some of it, but typically that doesn't cut it. All right, I see great choreography on mid poems, and it doesn't really make much of a difference in my personal opinion. All right, and number 5, the addition of big or new words to your vocabulary. There is nothing wrong with augmenting your vocabulary. You don't want to sound like a broken record with your speech. Ain't nothing wrong with adding to your vocabulary, okay? That's perfectly fine. But a lot of people think, like, okay, let me give you an example of what I mean, okay? I remember being in this one poetry workshop back in college, okay? I think it was my 3rd or 4th year of university. And one of the critiques my teacher made on my work is that my poetry was immature, isn't quite the right word. It was something like underdeveloped in nature, okay? I can't think of the exact word she utilized, but she implied that the strength of my writing could be better. And I took that to mean I was using like elementary language. I was using very rudimentary terms to describe what I was trying to discuss, okay? And that I needed to elevate the quality of my work by changing the vocabulary, all right? Adding bigger words, more complex words, things of that nature. And it just came across very forced. And the poem, in my opinion, became much worse than it already was. And like I'm telling you right now, a lot of poets are making this mistake thinking, oh, if I just add new words or bigger words, a lot of times, y'all, it just comes across as cringy. It doesn't come across natural or organic. All right, you want your work to come across as organic, very fluid in nature. Adding new or big words to your vocabulary is not going to be the difference maker between you not getting published and you getting published, or you getting a 10 on a spoken word poem and not. Chances are it's going to be marginal difference at best. Okay, so here's 5 examples of how the removal of negatives can actually improve your poetry. Number 1, the removal of excess articles and filler words from your work. Okay, by articles I mean a and the. I went to a store. I went to the store. I live in an apartment. You see what I'm trying to say? Now, articles are good. Don't get me wrong. They can either add specificity or generality to whatever you are trying to convey. That is a good thing most of the time. However, I do feel like they are often used in excess, and this is something a lot of poets overlook. Scanning their poetry, looking for where there are articles that don't really need to be there because they're simply acting as filler words. And there's other examples of filler words. And by filler, I mean words that don't contribute anything unique to the message you are trying to give. For page poets, this is particularly important, specifically because you only have so much space to work with. You have a finite amount of space on a page. It's like what, 8.5 by 11 inches? You see what I'm saying? You can't really be wasting that space. If you're a spoken word poet, this still applies to you. You might not have a finite amount of space to work with, but you do have a finite amount of words you can say in a single breath. Think about that. There's only so many words you can say in a single breath before you run out of breath and need to inhale once again. If you're a slam poet, so not only a spoken word poet, but a poet who like competes, your poems are timed. So the best way to make sure your poem remains under time is by removing words that don't need to be there at all. Whether that's a and the, whether that's other filler words, getting rid of those can go a long way in ensuring that you're not under pressure trying to make sure you finish on time, or you're gonna lose points on your poem, okay? Now, let me give an example of how this can be applied. Look at these two movie titles. I am a legendary person versus I am legend. Which one of these do you think holds more weight? I am legend, all right? And that's no surprise at all. Look, we removed a, I am a legendary person. We removed the article a, and then we removed the filler word person. It's not really necessary that that's there, okay? So now we're left with I am legendary, but even that airy suffix, is that even necessary in and of itself? I think a lot can be gained from removing airy. So instead of I am a legendary person, we now have I am legend, as in I, as in me, and the concept of legend, the idea of legend are one and the same. We are synonymous. Legend and me, there's no difference between the two. That holds a lot more weight, and that is way more enticing to an audience than I am a legendary person. Do you see how the removal of an article and a filler word can go a long way in improving your work? Utilize this in your poetry. Number 2, the removal of cliches. I don't think I need to explain this. As an artist, novelty and originality matter significantly. Don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with gaining insight or inspiration from other people's work, but if you really want to stand out and make it in the artist realm, and you need to do everything in your power to stand out, removal of cliches. All right, you want your work to have a signature sound or a signature look that helps people identify your art from everyone else's. Cliches are the enemy of novelty. I'm gonna give you a bunch of examples right now of cliches that have no business being in your work. Your eyes are as blue as the sky or the ocean. Roses are red, violets are blue. Play your cards right. That's the hand you were dealt. Read between the lines. Beauty is only skin deep. Beauty's in the eye of the beholder. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. What's done is done. It's an uphill battle. Better safe than sorry. You can't judge a book by its cover. Low-hanging fruit. The grass is always greener on the other side. Ignorance is bliss. Do you see what I'm saying? I'm pretty sure most, if not all of you, have heard every single one of these cliches before. And don't get me wrong, every now and then there is a place for cliches, especially if you're making a play on the fact that they are in fact cliches, and you're kind of like flipping it or twisting it, spinning it on its head, something of that sort. But simply using a cliche to convey a certain message to your audience, I believe that's lazy. In my personal opinion, I find that to be a lazy tactic that is seriously holding your poetry back, okay? Number 3, removal of verb tense errors. A verb tense error is when the verb tense changes abruptly in the middle of a sentence, okay? I walked to the store and I bought milk. That's problematic because walk is present tense, bought is past tense. So I should have said, I walked to the store and bought milk, or I walked to the store and I buy milk. The verb tense needs to remain the same, but so often I see poets make this mistake. I cannot tell you how many times I find verb tense errors in people's poetry that I give feedback on, all right? And what's very odd is it's one thing if you're not speaking like grammatically correct just due to vernacular or dialect that you're choosing to utilize in your poem. Most people, whether they have like great grammar or not, don't use verb tense errors in their speech unless they don't have a full fluency in the language. So I always wonder, like, why don't people scan for this? Because it's a very common mistake I see. Not because they don't understand proper English, more so because they're not scanning for it. They're not looking for it. And in simply getting their thoughts on the page, they don't consider whether the verb tense matches up throughout a single sentence, let alone an entire poem. All right, so make sure to look out for that. That can really be holding your poetry back. Number 4, the removal of what I call warm-ups. This is when a poet, oftentimes a novice poet or like a beginner poet, isn't very comfortable getting to the meat of the poem. So they have these extended introductions, these very long drawn out introductions that kind of warm up to the actual heat, the actual flame of the poem, the heart of the poem. Instead of just, giving the necessary introduction to get to that point, it's long and drawn out. And you'll notice over time, within like the 3 minutes you're performing, if you're a spoken word poet, or if you're a page poet, the few stanzas that they've been able to read through, they can only go so far before the audience is like, I'm good. The reader doesn't want to keep going. The listener tunes out, starts looking on their phone, stuff like that. I'm telling you right now, warm-ups can be the death of your poetry. Sometimes you just got to get to the point. Now, if there's an intro that you want to use as a really good hook to draw the audience in, that's fine. But more often than not, these warm-ups or extended introductions are conveying the fact that you are very timid or unsure of whatever you're trying to get across, okay? And a lot of times, confidence can go a long way, especially as a spoken word poet, in making sure that people take you seriously. And here's the thing, if you are passionate about the message you're trying to convey, and you want others to understand that you are passionate about that message, warming up and taking your time getting to the actual heat of the poem is not a good way to convey that. All right, it expresses timidness. All right, it expresses a lack of confidence. And if you're a page poet, that certainly matters, but especially if you're a spoken word poet or rapper. If you want people to take your message seriously, you just got to get to the point. You know what I'm saying? You can't just be drawing out the introduction until you feel comfortable enough to address the thing. All right, number 5, the removal of qualifiers. Qualifiers are not inherently bad. Just like articles, they have their place, they have their usefulness. In fact, sometimes they are most definitely needed. Okay? However, if used excessively, they can prevent you from being more direct in your message. So qualifiers are words that limit the meaning of phrases by expressing doubt or uncertainty. Some examples of what I mean is, instead of saying all, you say many, most, a majority. Instead of saying always, you say often, frequently, commonly, for a long time. Instead of saying never, you say rarely, infrequently, sporadic, seldom. I understand why you might want to use a qualifier, okay? Maybe you know the statistics of what you're trying to discuss don't actually say that every individual in this situation goes through this. That's fine. In poetry, however, it is okay in certain situations to exaggerate, to use a bit of hyperbole, okay, to stretch the truth somewhat. We do have poetic license, we do have creative liberties at our disposal, where hopefully our audience will understand we are just exaggerating. Absolute statements hit a lot harder than qualified statements, okay? One of my favorite poets, who isn't often considered a poet, but I certainly consider him to be one, Muhammad Ali. If you look at the poems he would recite during interviews, or poems that he would just write down, you'll notice he used a lot of absolute statements. I am the greatest, not I'm among the greatest, I have greatness, I am the greatest. You see what I'm saying? That holds a lot of power to it. Okay, I really hope you all enjoyed this. I certainly did. Again, to reiterate, the number one bad habit that is holding your poetry back is you're prioritizing the addition of mechanisms, the addition of new techniques, new forms, new cadences to improve your poetry, but you are neglecting the removal of negatives, the removal of bad habits that are holding your poetry back. So make sure to utilize the removal of negatives. These are not the only 5 examples of how you can make use of it in improving your poetry. There's many others that you can come up with, but these are 5 common ones I see poets avoiding. So if you enjoyed this video and you want to see more poetry lessons from me, make sure to like, subscribe, comment below what other lessons you want me to teach, and I'd be happy to do it. Obviously, I'm still doing reactions. I love reactions, you know what I'm saying? But these teaching videos, they bring me a lot of joy. So make sure to subscribe for more. All right, deuces.